Imagine waking up one morning to discover large swaths of your government simply won't open for business. National parks are barred, key programs are frozen, regulatory agencies go dark, and federal workers are told to stay home. In Washington, the blame game begins, but why did it come to this? Why do government shutdowns occur so often in the United States, as if they are built into the machinery, rather than rare breakdowns? And now, in 2025, the crisis returns, with Donald Trump playing a central, heated role. In this narration, we'll travel through the mechanics of shutdowns, the recurring structural fault lines, past lessons, reform proposals, and finally, the unfolding 2025 showdown and Trump's strategic stakes. The mechanics, how a shutdown happens by law, not by choice. To understand why shutdowns aren't freak accidents, you first need to see that they are a legal consequence of how U.S. federal spending is structured. Congress must pass, each fiscal year, appropriations bills to fund the operations of federal agencies and programs. If those bills aren't passed, or if Congress doesn't enact a continuing resolution, a stopgap measure, then funding gaps emerge. Under the Anti-Deficiency Act, federal agencies are legally barred from obligating or spending money without valid appropriation authority. In short, no funding, no new spending. Thus, a government shutdown is not a voluntary turn-off. It is the forced suspension of non-essential agency operations until Congress restores funding. Which functions continue? Essential operations, such as national security, law enforcement, air traffic control, still run, though personnel often work without pay until funding is restored. Why shutdowns happen often, structural and political drivers. Shutdowns aren't random storms, they emerge regularly because the U.S. budget and political system create incentives that push toward stalemate. Here are the main forces. 2.1 Fragmented authority and multiple veto points. The U.S. system divides power, the House, the Senate, and the President must each consent, via bills and signatures. If any one branch or chamber objects or stalls, the process can break. When government is divided, e.g. one party controls the House, another the Senate or Presidency, conflicts over priorities grow sharper. Because appropriations are broken into 12 separate bills, each covering different sectors, failure in any one can hold up the whole package. In addition, many lawmakers use policy riders, attaching controversial provisions, e.g. immigration, health, environment, to funding bills, to force high-stakes showdowns. If the opposing side resists riders, even otherwise routine funding can be blocked. The more fragmented and interdependent the process, the higher the chance that a breakdown in one area drags down the whole system. 2.2 Leverage, bargaining and shutdown threats. Because the consequences of a lapse are serious, threats of a shutdown often become tools in negotiation. One side may refuse to budge, preferring the brink rather than compromise. Politicians sometimes view the looming crisis as political leverage, to force the opposing side to concede. That means a shutdown can be engineered, or mismanaged, to shift blame or to force the other side's hand. Parties will often portray themselves as defenders of the people, while blaming opponents for the chaos. 2.3 Delay, continuing resolutions and workarounds. In practice, Congress often fails to meet deadlines. To avoid an abrupt shutdown, it passes continuing resolutions, CRs, which extend existing funding temporarily at current levels. But reliance on CRs means the government lives on borrowed time, raising the risk that in some year, negotiations will fail and a shutdown will be triggered. This patchwork, stopgap approach, rather than disciplined budgeting, weakens predictability and increases the odds of failure. 2.4 Polarization, ideological conflict and policy gridlock. In an era of intense partisan polarization, agreement on any major budget component is hard. Deep disagreements exist over tax policy, spending levels, entitlement programs, healthcare, defense, and regulation. Because budgets are zero-sum in many parts, any gain in one area must come with cuts elsewhere, making consensus tougher. When ideological confrontation becomes the norm, budget negotiations tend to devolve into standoffs. 2.5 External shocks and changing realities. Economic recessions, revenue shortfalls, crises, natural disasters, pandemics, upset assumptions built into budget plans. When forecasts diverge from reality, parties have to reallocate, renegotiate, or restructure, which adds friction and increases uncertainty. 2.6 Weak pressure to reform. Another recurring issue, shutdowns are often tolerated. The tools to punish or discipline lawmakers who engineer shutdowns are weak. Because the crisis is often resolved via temporary fixes and retroactive pay, there's little lasting political incentive to reform the system. Those who benefit from brinksmanship, in print media attention, media leverage, or political messaging, may resist structural changes. 3. Lessons from history. Shutdowns in U.S. history show recurring patterns and cautionary lessons. 3.1 The legal shift in 1980. Before 1980, lapses in funding didn't always lead to full shutdowns. But an Attorney General memo in 1980, from Benjamin C. Villetti, asserted that agencies must stop operations absent valid appropriation. That helped cement the legal interpretation that funding gaps lead to forced suspension of non-essential services. Since that legal shift, funding gaps reliably lead to shutdowns whenever Congress fails to act. 3.2 Notable shutdowns and their conflicts. 1995 to 1996, Clinton versus Republican Congress disputes over budget cuts, education, environment, and Newt Gingrich-style spending reductions. The government shut down twice, first for 5 days, then for 21 days. 2013, Obama-era a 16-day shutdown over a Republican push to block or delay the Affordable Care Act. 2018 to 2019, Trump-era the longest shutdown in U.S. history, 35 days, driven by a battle over funding for the U.S. Mexico border wall. These show a pattern. Shutdowns arise during clashes over high-visibility policy fights, immigration, health, spending, not simply technical budget delays. 3.3 Costs, fallout and political consequences. Shutdowns inflict real damage. Economic drag, lost economic activity, delayed contracts, drag on GDP growth. Service disruption, closures of parks, labs, regulatory delays, judicial backlogs. Impact on federal workers, furloughs, uncertainty, reduced morale, stress, delayed pay. Political blame and fallout, public frustration, reputational damage, electoral consequences. Longer-term damage, breaks in continuity of projects, backlog accumulation, reputational risk to U.S. governance. Yet time and again, shutdowns end with stopgap funding and retroactive pay, which mitigates the damage for some, but fails to reform the root causes. 4. Reform ideas and structural fixes. Over the years, scholars and policy advocates have proposed several reforms to reduce shutdown risk. Here are some leading ideas, along with the challenges they face. 4.1 Automatic Continuing Resolutions, Auto-CRS. If Congress fails to pass funding by deadline, funding automatically continues at baseline levels for a fixed period. That would remove the immediate shutdown trigger and reduce leverage for brinkmanship. 4.2 Consolidation and Omnibus Budgeting. Rather than 12 separate bills, bundling them into fewer, larger packages, or omnibus bills, could reduce fragmentation and coordination risk. 4.3 Biennial Budgeting. Moving from an annual to a 2-year budget cycle could relax the pressure of constant deadlines and provide more breathing room for negotiations. 4.4 Penalties and incentive alignment. Some proposals suggest docking lawmakers' pay when budgets aren't passed, e.g. the no budget, no pay idea. In fact, a 2025 version of that, Senate Bill 88, would penalize lawmakers' pay for days they fail to pass the budget resolution and appropriations. Other ideas include requiring immediate floor votes, stronger deadlines, or structural accountability measures. 4.5 Institutional overhaul or new mechanisms. Other reform ideas include creating an independent budget commission that handles fallback funding. Revising or limiting the scope of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Structural rework in Congress to reduce the power of riders. Built-in default funding formulas or fallback authority. The catch is, many of these reforms threaten the strategic advantages that legislators currently enjoy, so political resistance is steep. 5. Setting the stage, why 2025 is different and risky. In 2025, many of the underlying tensions have intensified, making a shutdown more likely than usual, and potentially more consequential. 5.1 Expiring appropriations and no full bills yet. As of late September 2025, no fiscal year 2026 appropriations bills have been enacted. That means when the fiscal year begins October 1st, the government faces a lapse in appropriations unless Congress passes a continuing resolution first. Negotiations were underway, especially for sectors like agriculture (FDA) and military construction (VA), but they are not ready to carry the bulk of operations. 5.2 Clash over healthcare and ACA subsidies. One of the central flashpoints is healthcare, specifically whether to restore or extend Affordable Care Act tax credits and funding that support millions of Americans. Democrats insist these provisions must be part of any funding deal. Republicans, controlling both House and Senate, have pushed for a clean, continuing resolution first, without such riders. This gives Democrats leverage in the Senate, especially given that Republicans need Democratic votes, or at least cooperation, to break filibusters in that chamber. 5.3 Sharp escalation, threat of mass firings. In a dramatic escalation from past shutdowns, the White House has instructed agencies to prepare reduction in force, RIF, plans, i.e., permanent job cuts, for programs without funding. That signals an intention to not merely furlough, but to reshape, shrink, or eliminate non-priority functions. This is a departure from previous shutdowns where the goal was temporary suspension, not permanent restructuring. 5.4 Trump's role and messaging strategy. Donald Trump's presidency is central to the 2025 showdown, both in tactics and in tone. He has blamed Democrats for the impending shutdown, arguing they prioritize special interests and immigrant benefits over stability. He spoke publicly of the need for Republicans to do things differently, signaling that negotiations may follow his personal terms. Yet he has also shown some openness to bipartisan paths in private talks, though major differences remain in public. Pushed the narrative that Democrats are holding the government hostage via demands it calls unreasonable or political. In sum, Trump's posture is combative, leveraging executive power and pushing structural reorganization in relation to the shutdown. 5.5 Growing stakes and fallout. If a shutdown happens now, the Department of Health and Human Services plans to furlough 41% of its workforce, disrupting public health oversight, research, and communication functions. Centers for Disease Control would furlough about 64% of staff, NIH would furlough 75% of personnel. Airlines warn that air traffic control, aircraft safety inspections, new certifications, and other critical FAA services will face delays, disruptions, and risk. Labor Department would suspend the release of key economic data, including the September employment report, affecting markets and policy calculations. Courts, regulatory bodies, grant programs, and many administrative services would be delayed or partially shuttered. Federal workers in non-essential roles get furloughed, in essential roles, they work without pay. The political fallout is likely severe, public frustration, blame campaigns, and damage to institutional trust. 6. The 2025 shutdown, what to watch and possible outcomes. As the deadline looms, several factors will determine how, when, and at what cost the shutdown unfolds. 6.1 Which deal gets passed or blocked? House Republicans passed a short-term funding measure, Clean, CR, to extend operations through November 21st, but Democrats, particularly in the Senate, have blocked it. Democrats insist any continuing resolution must include healthcare subsidies and related provisions. If Republicans resist, stalemate continues. Democrats have refused to support a pure CR, arguing it undermines protections and priorities they see as essential. Which side yields, or which compromise emerges, will determine who is blamed. 6.2 Trump's leverage and new tactics. Trump's push for mass firings, as opposed to temporary furloughs, ups the stakes. It sends a signal: this shutdown may be used to reshape government, not just pause it. Agencies have already been told to draw up reduction plans. Thus, the shutdown isn't just a stoppage, it's a structural move. 6.3 Phasing and partial shutdowns. Some parts of the government may remain funded, if certain appropriation bills pass, even as others shut down, resulting in a partial shutdown. Which sectors get spared and which get cut speaks to political priorities, internal trade-offs, and negotiation strength. 6.4 Duration and escalation. If the shutdown drags, disruptions deepen, costs mount, and pressure to settle intensifies. But with Trump's higher stakes posture and reorganization plans, ending it may mean ceding structural ground. Also, the longer the shutdown lasts, the greater the political risk for both sides, though history shows many shutdowns eventually bend to compromise. 6.5 Reform momentum and post-shutdown aftermath. If the 2025 shutdown brings significant disruption, there may be renewed calls for reform, auto-CR, no budget no pay, restructuring the appropriations process. The 2025 No Budget No Pay Act proposal, Senate Bill 88, is illustrative of such efforts. But whether political will accommodate structural change is uncertain. Many of the forces that allowed shutdowns before will try to preserve their leverage. 7. Final reflections and messaging strategy. Government shutdowns often feel chaotic and dramatic, but in reality they arise from the structural design of U.S. fiscal politics. They are built into the architecture of authority, deadlines, fragmented appropriations, and political incentives. Because they are predictable, in structure, if not in timing, they reveal fault lines: who holds leverage, which policies are non-negotiable, and how political legitimacy is tested. 2025 is more dangerous than past shutdowns. The threat of permanent cuts, Trump's direct intervention, and high-stakes policy fights make this more than a temporary disruption. It feels like a turning point. Regardless of the immediate outcome, the 2025 showdown may accelerate debates about reform, whether the system can be changed or must break again before repair. For your viewers, watch for who blinks first, which sectors get spared or sacrificed, whether Trump carries through on firings, and how public opinion shifts mid-crisis.